Sanbanan Dumlang, hello, it's me, your host Sviso, and welcome back to another episode of my podcast, Simply Do the Work. I just want to say thank you once again for those who continually listen to the podcast. I know I'm not as consistent this time around as I used to be, but as I explained, life is busy, and I'd actually asked because this month I'm recording this at the end of September, right? I was on leave for 5 days, and I had planned to actually record some content while I was on leave. But child, I was tired. I was like, let me just rest and recharge. And I'm actually kind of glad that I didn't actually make a podcast episode because the episode I'm recording today was not what I originally planned. So on my last day of leave, I actually met up with someone for breakfast, and we talked about books we like reading, like what are you recently reading, and I mentioned a book, and they were like, oh, self-help, not a fan. And I was like, what do you mean? And they went on to explain the reasons why they don't like self-help, and I was like, oh, interesting. Because self-help happens to be one of my favorite genres, and also I create self-help content, so it was part of me was just trying to internalize what they're saying and not take it as a personal attack. But also, this past week I've been vexed, just trying to think what the hell am I doing? But yeah, before we dive into it, I just want to ask you guys, if you're not yet subscribed, do subscribe. Also give the podcast a rating and share it on social media. Share it to whoever think might need this podcast episode. So yeah, let us get into it and try to answer the question of, is self-help a scam? So yeah, ever since that conversation, I've been thinking about this topic, right? I've also done some reading and research, and so it's not the first time I've actually been presented with this idea of whether or not is self-help actually helpful. Because self-help comes in various forms, right? There's the YouTube videos, there's the books, the podcasts, and I think as people who are constantly trying to improve their lives or constantly trying to better themselves, I think there's nothing wrong with looking for outside material. But Mark Manson, who happens to also be the author of a self-help book, pointed out that usually self-help books don't actually bring anything new to the table most of the time. It's stuff you've already known, right? According to him, self-help has always existed, just it's always been called by different names, whether it be philosophy, religion, and, he mentions that, a lot of people sometimes fall into this thing of, self-help, it targets two groups of people in mind, right? So you have the people who are sort of okay and want to do just become good, and people who are not okay and want to become okay, not bad, but they want to become good, and people who are okay but they want to be super good. I'm paraphrasing terribly what he said, but yeah. But the thing is, usually the people who benefit most from self-help are people who are okay and just want to become a little bit better, because the people who start off and they're not in a good place, usually self-help can send them into a sort of spiral where instead of actually helping you, you kind of feel like you have more problems to begin with, which is what the person who was actually having breakfast with mentions. He feels as people, we have people who are over therapized and people who are under therapized, and that is something that I'm actually quite aware of. That's why I tend to I try as much as possible to avoid using psychological terms, right, incorrectly, especially being someone who is a trained medical doctor. I recognize that words have meanings, words like OCD, depression, anxiety, and while for depression and anxiety, they can refer to the normal feelings that everyone has, but they also do refer to mental illness, which that is when you're talking about having a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, that is completely different from feeling anxious before writing a test or anxious before doing something that scares you, which is like normal part of the human experience. And I think what some self-help authors and creators, what they do is they try to diagnose and pathologize even like normal everyday experiences, right? Like I know there's some books sometimes you read and it's kind of like okay, you telling me I've got this that and third, but it's like okay, but like you don't actually give concrete solutions and problems. I think that's concrete solutions to the problems. What am I saying? And I think that's kind of what some people, they're trying to put you into this vicious cycle of you feel bad about yourself, right? And so you're like, okay, let me buy another book that's gonna help me, or let me subscribe to this course, because it's also right. This there's the ethical question of it, especially people who make money from this industry, because it's an industry where a lot of money can be made, right? Obviously, it's like if people come out, better, like if after reading a self-help book you're fine, your life gets better, they've lost you as a customer. You know what I'm saying? It's like, why wouldn't they want to rather just keep you into this sort of like spiral, into this like sort of feedback loop where like you read this book and you might feel better for a minute, but then you're like, you know what, but my life is not as good as it should be. Let me buy another book. Let me buy another book. And so that's like the one issue with, I guess, self-help that needs that, is that instead of actually helping people, it's preying on people's vulnerabilities. It's preying on people who actually do need help, and not actually giving them solutions, but rather sinking them deeper and deeper into whatever pit of despair, whatever troubles that they're in. The second one is that, which, and this, I mean, the first one, that's more criticism of like the industry, and the second one I think falls on us. Me, I fall on both sides as someone who both creates and consumes this content. But like, as a creator, as my first point, I never want to be preying on people's vulnerabilities or insecurities. That's why I think, that's why I do honestly believe, like, if you need to speak to a professional, you should do that, right? Like, no book, no podcast, no YouTube video, no TikTok. Oh, don't get me started on TikTok. It's gonna substitute, getting like actual professional help with whatever you're dealing with. But then secondly, sometimes, and I think this is, where I fall into a lot, I think a lot of us fall into, is that you know what you need to do, but isn't it a lot easier just to read a book about it, or like listen to a podcast about it? Like, for example, me, right? One of my I don't say weaknesses, but you could say it's a weakness. Like, I very much dislike conflict. Like, I'm very like non-confrontational, right? And I'm a people pleaser, right? And so instead of actually trying to take meaningful steps to better that, I could just, and I do, just listen to a podcast episode on, how to stop being a people pleaser, or looking up a book on, how to get better at confrontation. And the thing is, I mean, in the moment, right, when you're listening to this content, you feel like, yes, oh yes, like, like someone's telling you, how they feel, and like when someone's like sharing like their experiences, right, and you're like, yes, that is so me. And they tell you how they, and you like, and you have this hope that, what, if they can get through it, so can I. And then you find yourself next time in a situation where you need to confront someone, and you just fall right back into old habits. You're just like, never mind. And I think this is where it can then tie into the first issue I raised, is that, and then you start feeling bad about yourself, like, oh, I didn't do the thing. Maybe I need another book. Maybe I need to listen to another podcast, And so then it just becomes this loop of like knowing what you need to do, but not actually doing it. It's like also, like, for example, like if you have a specific relationship with someone that you need to fix, right? Obviously, to fix that relationship, you need to pick up the phone, either text them or call them, but set up and actually have a conversation with them, whatever the issue is, But it's a lot easier to maybe just read a book about conflict, read a book about fixing relationship, and then like, oh, yes, that is great, that's so profound. But then not really making any meaningful changes, But something else that Mark Manson actually mentions, that, sometimes I think one of the allures, or why people might also be attracted to self-help, is because of like the packaging, right? Because the thing about advice, I have a very simple advice, right? I mean, not advice, example of this phenomenon. I don't know what it's called, but basically, I remember like my little sister, right? I remember once telling her that, hey, in order for if you want to have good growth for your hair, it's important to like trim your ends. It's like, let me trim your ends. It's like, I'm like, you're not getting a haircut, we're just trimming your ends, and she flat out refused, right? And then a couple months later, one day she just burst into my room. She's like, I want you to trim my ends. I'm like, why the sudden change? Because apparently some girl on YouTube that she likes to watch like made a video talking about the importance of like trimming your ends, and now because it came from her, now she wants to do it. And I was just like, girl, I've been telling you that it's like you should trim your ends. I think that's another thing about self help. Sometimes, you know, who like sometimes it's not even like I mentioned earlier, like it's not new information being presented to you, but sometimes because of who is telling this to you, whether it's a celebrity or it's someone who claims to be an expert in the field. I'm using that word claim because some people be lying, right? But I think also sometimes someone who you respect also, or an authoritative figure, like for example, if I'm reading a book, for example, like if I wrote a book on bodybuilding, right? That would really be me just scamming the masses, because what do I know about bodybuilding, right? But there could be some people who, because it's me and because they value and respect my opinion, they'll take seriously what I'm saying. Also, I mean, never mind the fact that I am a medical doctor, right? Sometimes like, oh, because the person's a doctor, they're writing on this topic, they're clearly knowledgeable, and then they'll take what I'm saying, which goes into the point I raised earlier about people taking advantage, right? It's different if, for example, then let's say a psychiatrist writes a book on managing depression and anxiety, and maybe there's someone who has depression and anxiety, they might actually benefit from that book, or even someone who maybe writes a book for, family members and relatives on how to support someone who has depression and anxiety, I think that's also another field of self-help that I think kind of maybe isn't maybe explored well enough, is like how to support other people who are going through certain things. Because I mean, at the end of the day, I do think like a lot of us, we want to better ourselves, we want to become better people, we want to gain more knowledge, right? And so I think self-help industry, they definitely real, like I've just scratched the surface on the issues with the self-help industry, but there's definitely a lot, but I think that it can also be, I feel like it's a double-sided coin, right? There's the good and the bad. And I think for some people self-help is not for them, right? I think for some people self-help could actually be a lot more detrimental, because another point, like another thing that often comes up in self-help is the issue of toxic positivity, and affirmations. And but the thing they say, those sort of like affirmation stuff work for someone who's already has a pretty good self-esteem. If you're already feeling bad about yourself and someone's just tell yourself every day that you're beautiful, but you don't believe that about yourself, you end up going back into that toxic feedback I was talking about, where you start feeling worse because like, okay, I'm supposed to know and believe that I'm this amazing person, but I don't feel that way. So if I'm not feeling that way, that means there's something wrong with me, And sometimes maybe there is something not necessarily wrong with you, but maybe there is just something that you need to go consult for and see someone about. And I actually wasn't planning on sharing this, but I've actually recently went to a doctor, and mentioned that, hey, I've been feeling somewhat anxious lately. I'm struggling to fall asleep, and that's the journey that I'm now on, because I recognize, and I mean, I'm not gonna share the details because I'm still in the thick of it, And one of my favorite quotes, which I learned from Father Shannon Kearns, it was like, I don't know who coined it, but I heard it from him, right, from queer theology, that we should always speak from scars and not wounds, right? And so I'm not going to share the details of what's happening because it's a wound, right? But basically it's like, as much as when I come onto this platform, right, I'm sharing my story, I'm sharing what's working for me. I am cognizant of the fact that, I don't know everything, right? I'm not trying to present myself as some authoritative figure. Um, that's why I always say, take what I say with a grain of salt. Like, if you listen to a podcast of mine and you think, so you are talking absolute BS, that is fine. Cause I be reading books. So like sometimes even like my favorite, like I'll be reading the book, and overall I enjoy the book, but there'll be like one or two chapters. I'm like, you know what, over there, I don't know what Gerda was talking about. Um, but I think it's like This is me basically saying, at some point, I think you need to recognize that just listening to a podcast, just reading a book isn't going to be enough. Sometimes you actually need to do the thing. It's like I said a couple of podcasts back, like talking about doing the thing, planning to do the thing is not doing the thing. I feel like most of the time we know what we need to do to change our lives. We know exactly what we need to do, but instead of doing it, we'd rather read a book about it. And sometimes, it takes reading a book. Sometimes, sometimes I mean, we all know that you need to eat healthy, you need to, exercise. But sometimes you need to listen to a podcast, let someone tell you that, to remind you that, like, what, actually, I need to do that, or reading it into a book, and I think that's really what I tried to do with this podcast. Like that conversation, like it put me in a little bit of a existential crisis, but it also had me, I had to sit down with myself and like take stock. But okay, what are we doing with this podcast? Simply do the work. Like, am I part of the problem? And if in any way or shape or form, right, I say or do something that's inauthentic or problematic, I would love to be called out. I mean, I'll be honest, right? Obviously, being called out is not easy, right? Everyone says to call me out, but once someone actually does call you out on your BS, like I have those friends that when they do, it's like in the moment it's not gonna be nice, but obviously when I reflect on it, I will come back and be like, you know what, actually, yeah, I need to do better there, and that's why, like, I do always try also, like, whatever I share or say on this podcast, it's in the moment I truly do believe that, like I remember there was a time, this was like a couple years ago, when someone was bringing up something I said in a video, and they were like, what about you said this and that, and they're like, basically try to have be like a gotcha moment. And I didn't respond to them, but I thought to myself, okay, look, that video at the time was like, okay, that was me a year ago. I thought I knew what I was talking about back then. I don't. I've changed, and like I have debated also, like, deleting some episodes because of the fact that I was like, oh, what was I saying there? But at the same time, I also feel like, that's just life, man. We're always growing and evolving. I mean, at age 20, I started this podcast thinking I knew everything, and now I'm at age 24, realizing that, girl, I knew nothing. I mean, some of the things that I'm surprised by, like the way I handled certain situations, are like, actually, wow, I mean, at the time, I felt like I didn't know what I was doing, but I actually knew that I had a pretty good idea. And there's some things which I was so sure of. Now I'm just like, I don't know. And it'll be very interesting to see, a couple years from now, where my views and how my life will be different. But yeah, like, the theme for today's episode is, don't just listen to this podcast, actually do the work, right? Don't just leave this episode or any of my episodes on a high. I'm like, yes, let me go change my life. Actually, let's do the thing, okay? I think I have rambled an ear and a half off already. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed, please do, I almost said give it a thumbs up. I'm not on YouTube, girl. But do rate the podcast. I mean, if you are listening on YouTube, you can give this a thumbs up because the podcast is available on YouTube. So give it a thumbs up. Share, reach out to me on social media at Simply Sfisa on all platforms. And yeah, until next time, I love you guys so much. Bye.